Hi, everyone, and welcome to EV Nickel's live summit today. I'm pleased to introduce our speakers, their president and CEO, Sean Samson, as well as their VP of Exploration, Paul Davis. Sean and Paul are going to be taking us through a company presentation, and after, we're going to be entering into a Q&A session. So feel free to ask any questions you'd like in the Q&A panel found on the right-hand side of your screen at any time. And if you'd like to, of course, get in contact with the team, feel free to fill out the survey that's linked at the top of the chat. As always, the summit is being recorded, and it's going to be available on 6.com to watch in the coming days. So take a look for that if you want to refresh. Without further ado, Sean, I'd like to pass things over to you so we can get started.
Thanks, Cam, and welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. The topic we're going to talk about today is we're drilling down specifically on our clean nickel research and development. And this is an area that is core to our company. So the reason we set this whole thing up with EV Nickel is not just to find the nickel in the ground, which we spend a lot of time talking about our mineralization, but also to do a rethink on each of the steps of what potential operations would look like, driving for the lowest possible carbon cost. We wrap that all under the umbrella of clean nickel, our trademark term, and that's where we're going to spend our time today. So we're going to speak about the future. So of course, there's a legal disclaimer to keep in mind when we're talking about what could happen. So let me just set us up. What is clean nickel? There's a few things we believe. We think there's not going to be enough nickel available for the electric vehicle rollout plans. So, pick your forecast. And it seems as though very soon the nickel world is going to shift to be majority for the electric vehicle batteries. And the nickel for those batteries, that requires low carbon cost. So this is something that's new for the mining business, and it's forcing the mining companies to react to these new demands that are coming on from the new demand for nickel. And it's not just trying to find lowest carbon cost nickel, but there's also complexity around general nickel supply, and it goes well beyond carbon, which we'll talk a bit about. So this is my only macro data slide about the nickel world. Top left, we follow so many decisions are being made now by the car companies where they're shifting from internal combustion over to electric vehicles. What that means, top right, is when you bolt on the demand forecast for the automotive, for the batteries that go into the EVs, you have extreme growth in what the demand is going to be. Bottom left, when you stack up the known supply and this forecast demand, there is very likely going to be a future gap. So a disconnect between the amount of nickel that's being produced, the supply, and how much is required, the demand. So that should mean good things for the nickel price, but then you've also got this consideration around carbon. So specifically in the EU, as we've laid out here at the bottom right, there is approved regulation that next year, January 2024, all vehicles in the UK are being stamped with their kilometer zero carbon cost. And what that means is you have the car companies that are aggressively looking to source not just nickel, but also nickel with the lowest possible carbon cost. So it's no longer a nice to have, it's a need to have for those of us in the nickel mining space. So, and beyond carbon, the world is becoming a smaller place for these car companies. We spend a lot of time talking to the downstream demand, and it is complicated. If you're at a car company trying to find the nickel that is required for your future EV batteries. So from the access perspective, with what's happening in Ukraine, so the terrible war there, it means that Western companies can't deal with the Russians, one of the largest nickel suppliers in the world. And then the next step, and we hear about this a lot, is the largest production in the world comes out of Indonesia and secondly, Philippines. Much of that is Chinese money behind those countries and their production. And people are concerned if Taiwan becomes the next Ukraine, then potentially that comes off the board as well. So just accessing the stuff is getting complicated. Then there's protectionism. So the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, that's great news for a company like ours that's sitting on a huge amount of nickel in Canada, friendly ally of the US. But generally speaking, when you put up protectionist walls, that becomes very complicated for these global buyers of nickel. And then also you just have these general ESG concerns. And I throw into this bucket concerns about labor conditions, generally speaking, child labor, who is the realistic owner of the assets. This is that issue in the Indonesia and the Philippines. Is it just Chinese money come in? in addition to environmental challenges like deep water tailings. There's a lot of hair around a lot of nickel projects. And as the car companies wade into the space, they realize that their world is becoming much smaller. And as we are realizing, the car companies and their battery suppliers are looking to come up the supply chain to secure the nickel supply. So that's what we believe. What we have is we have known nickel mineralization across an enormous land package just outside of Timmins, Ontario. We have more than 30,000 hectares, more than 100 kilometers of strike, and we have two tracks of potential development. One is our high-grade track, starting with what we call the W4. That has an historic resource. We've done a bunch of drilling. We've made a bunch of discoveries. That is bigger than it was thought of in 2010. We're soon going to come out with a new updated resource on that high grade. We're going to talk a bit about that today. And then in the track 2, the large scale, as we call it, we have an enormous deposit. We drilled off just the first 20% of the card laying area, came out with the A zone resource earlier this year. It's one of the largest resources in the world, and we think it stacks up great in terms of it being near surface with minimal overburden and excellent access. And then what we're going to talk about today with the clean nickel, we wrap this all together with our research and development. Paul, do you want to set us up as to sort of where our land is located?
Sure. Basically, Timmins area, I've been working in the Timmins area probably for the last 35 years, exploring for nickel in a gold camp. I've had some great success discovering new things, and really about 6 new zones of sulfide nickel mineralization, brought one of them into production. The other 2 or 3 have gone into a resource category. And really, it's a great place to look for nickel. Timmins itself is a wonderful city. You have basically all of your service and people working within 50 kilometers of the Shaw Dome. So people work in our sites, they go home to their own beds, they sleep. They really love working with us and for us down in the Shaw Dome. And the Shaw Dome's exactly where you want to be. It is one of the only places in the Abitibi that you have the outcrop with the mineralization at surface in these ultramafic flows. They're generally very soft. When the glaciers come through, they erode it away and they tend to get buried in quite a bit of overburden, anywhere from upwards to 10 to 20 meters of overburden in places. But here we have outcrop throughout the Shaw Dome with our mineralization exposed to surface. And to orient you to the 2 tracks that Sean mentioned, track 1 is a high-grade W4 in the southern part of the Shaw Dome. And there are some great synergies in the Shaw Dome with already defined other deposits of high-grade mineralization, which includes both the Hart deposit as well as an operating mill that processes nickel sulfides located only about 7 kilometers from our W4 deposit. Both of those are privately owned by one of our investors, but we see a lot of potential here in the Shaw Dome, not only to work with our investor, but also to find new sources of high-grade mineralization. We'll soon be out with an updated resource on our W4. We're pulling it together now. With all the drilling we've done over the past 3 years, we see a lot of opportunity to grow that deposit, extending it down plunge, adding another entire section from 200 down to about 450 meters depth. It's hugely prospective. It's still open along plunging down the trend. So we're quite excited about W4. Then we have the track 2. It's a large scale. It's called the Car Lang area. It extends for over 10 kilometers. We've only drilled off the first 20% of this zone. So basically there's 5 times more potential there than what we've already identified. And we put out a resource for the A zone earlier this year. It's a world-class deposit, and we believe it's about 5 times bigger than what we've identified so far if you just track the ultramafics as exposed on surface from outcrop. All of this is in a land package that's very close to a large mining town. We're connected by road and power line, and it's important that we draw hydropower, which is a very clean power source. It's also critical that we're able to supply these potential new areas down in southern Ontario, and we're all within about 1,000 kilometers of the new plants being built to generate the electric batteries that are going to be going into these electric vehicles of the future.
Thanks, Paul. So yeah, it's a great place to be where we are. And if I pull it together in terms of what we were up to last year, we made a number of discoveries. Paul mentioned that we've got the new resource coming out in the W4. We also further south on the Groves Matthew zone made a discovery last year, and then also the A zone with the Carlang, for which we've already come out with the resource. So we've done a bunch of exploration. That mineralization is sort of where we spend majority of our time talking about the company. And today we're focused in on that clean nickel strategy. So, why we're doing this is, and we're a nickel junior, so of course we're going to have a slide talking about demand and specifically with Elon Musk, but it's very interesting to follow what he has said about the nickel space. So there, of course, is the great headline where he said, we want nickel miners to be mining more nickel. And that was really what unlocked, especially all the nickel juniors, sent them off to the races to try to find more nickel. But if you listen to other stuff that he said, he really, and this reflects what these EV companies are finding themselves as they wade into the nickel space. They realize the complexity of the supply chain that's been developed and how we have an industry where you've got nickel that comes out of the ground in one part of the world, pings to another part of the world for processing, and then goes to another part of the world for final processing. You see that when you look at the companies down in Sudbury, south of Timmins, and how they produce nickel. But this is a real head shaker for the car companies as they're wading in, trying to buy nickel supply, and then realizing that, lo and behold, even though a district like Northern Ontario has lots of nickel in the ground and nickel operations, there isn't necessarily the nickel that they're looking to buy in that jurisdiction. So the complexity of the supply chain, which has developed sort of organically over time with companies having assets around the world, doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense for the new demand coming in, and especially doesn't make a lot of sense when you're considering what the carbon cost is. So he's asking us, just as all of the car companies are asking, for miners to be rethinking the way they do things. And that's really where clean nickel comes in for us. So this is our trademarked term. It's the umbrella, as I referred to it. It's us questioning each of the steps. So our current plans for research and development include a couple areas. We've got bioleaching, which Paul is going to talk a bit about, in addition to the carbon capture potential of our rock, which is really interesting stuff. And then beyond that, especially leveraging the clean hydropower that we're on the line for, we can electrify things, make use of ore sortation and items like that. And what we can do is use all of these and target the lowest possible carbon cost per nickel per unit of nickel. So it's really exciting. There's a huge amount of potential. We're going to run you through the stuff we're working on just now, but really this is just the beginning of the potential with the R&D. I say that, but now Paul will walk you through the details. Paul, you want to sort of introduce us to bioleaching?
Sure. Bioleaching is a natural process that's been going on for a very long time. Basically, if you see rust on your car, that is bioleaching in action. So it's converting the metals in the rock into a solution that then is captured by the process. So really, you mine the rock out of the ground, it gets crushed or agglomerated, and then you can take it down two tracks. One could be you concentrate it into a rougher, cleaner concentrate. It goes into tanks, which is really, so you're concentrating the amount of nickel that you're processing. Second one is you could heap leach it and put it onto a pile, which you then precipitate on your bugs and your sulfuric acid. All the nickel goes into solution, and then you're able to actually precipitate that nickel out of solution into whatever kind of tailored product you like. You could do a hydroxide, you could do a sulfate, you could even reprecipitate it as nickel sulfide or nickel metal if you were willing to electrolyte it. Okay, so now here's a typical flow sheet for what we're looking at doing with our bioleaching up in Timmins. We've done the preliminary test work, and we've seen that this sulfide ore is very amenable to bioleaching. We're seeing that upwards of 90% of the nickel was extracted through our bioleaching in our tests that we've done. Really what we've done is we've grown a naturally occurring bacteria in the area, so it's localized, it's already used to the climate, it's used to the rock types. It really is adapted to what we're going to be doing. We've bulked this up, and we're going to be putting it through the process. Compare that to the normal way of processing nickel sulfides. What we would have to do is we'd have to mine it, concentrate it, truck it off to a smelter where it gets burned with a lot of SO2, so your acid rain emissions coming out, having to capture that into a nickel matte, and then it gets further processed in a refinery to take out the nickel and the copper and the PGs, some of which is done in Europe. So it's really a long process with a lot of other added CO2 costs to it just to get it from site to site.
Yeah, so this is a real game changer for us. This potential, if we're successful and we're able to be producing from our Shaw Dome location exactly the end product that's required by the battery plants in Southern Ontario, it's a really neat unlock of value for us. But Paul, this isn't new, right? So it's being done, it had been done around the world.
This is not new. This is a technology that's been going on for a long time. Basically, if you take a look throughout the world, the largest particular nickel bioleaching plant is at Terrafame in Finland, where they're doing the heap leaching, but they are like the 6th largest nickel producer in the world. And so they use bioleaching and the heap leaching. There's also other examples of tank leaching in Australia, Asia, and the Middle East. So this isn't something new. The technology is there. What we're looking at doing is really improving the process, getting higher extraction and having it done right near where we're actually taking it out of the ground, not having to transport at great distances just to get the nickel.
So that's a little time on the bioleaching. Let's shift over to the other area for our R&D now. And Paul, maybe you can introduce us to carbon capture and where we're at with that work.
Sure. In a lot of the rocks within the Shaw Dome, they're called dunites and pertites, and basically they're almost made up entirely of one mineral called olivine. As this mineral was altered, it forms other minerals, and these other minerals are highly reactive with CO2. So examples of those are like brucite or hydrotalcite. They suck up the CO2. It's actually a very quick process. There is some test work done on old tailings deposits in Australia and in Canada that show even the tailings that were pumped out without any treatment have been absorbing a significant amount of CO2 just on their own without having to do anything else. And what we're doing is we're looking at measuring that potential. We've done the test work. We show that we have brucite, hydrotalcite, and it's in similar concentrations to what they have in one of the best case studies in Australia in terms of their percentages. Now we're going to actually quantify how much CO2 these particular minerals can capture from our Carline A zone specifically, which has a great accumulation of it. We're talking about several billion tons of potential carbon sequestration type rocks. So this could be a really significant add-on to our business.
Yeah, and you actually see it with the rocks, where when we chip off from the outcrop that Paul was referring to, you see that the carbon has penetrated the rock just naturally from the atmosphere. So you have this thick black crust on the rock from the Carling, and that's really what we're trying to analyze and be able to calculate how much carbon is sequestered. So we're doing all this work, those 2 tracks to start with. We've got a lot of funding from government. So we've had success with the federal government plus the provincial government with large dollar values. There's a lot of excitement at the government level for innovation in mining. And subsequently, there's a lot of funding sources as well related to innovation around mining. So basically, you have these Canadian governments that are so interested in being part of the critical minerals evolution, with wanting to be part of electrifying ground transportation. In Ontario especially, we have a huge amount of automotive jobs. And as there's so much change going on in the car companies, you have the federal and the provincial government wanting to be part of that new economy. And they know that upstream, ensuring that critical minerals are able to get out of the ground and successfully supply these companies is an important part of that chain. So there's a huge amount of interest and excitement and also funding from both our federal government and our provincial government. And we've been able to take advantage of that. And then in terms of the companies we're working with across our R&D, it's all being coordinated through an Ontario-based engineering firm called EPCM. And then we use the best in the business as subcontractors beneath that. So in the bioleaching world, Paul's pulling together a concentrate sample right now using SGS, the lab that does our general metallurgy as well. plus the work that's being done with the bioleaching and breeding the bugs and the bacteria. That's being done by RPC, which is globally one of the smartest labs in the world for this stuff. And then over in the carbon capture, we're using a group that spun out from UBC out in Vancouver, ARCA. So they have done this on other projects. They have the lab all set up to be able to do these calculations. And ARCA are the subcontractors for EPCM on the carbon capture work we're getting done. Then for next step, there's a lot of opportunity. Again, taking advantage of the hydropower for material movement. There's a lot of neat work that's being done now where you don't need to be running big diesel trucks fed by big diesel excavators and loaders. You can instead electrify your material movement. There's an Ontario-based company that we're working with. In addition to sort of the world leader in this is a European company, and that will be on our horizon as we begin to get more detailed on our mine plans. And then around developing the methodology so we can capture the carbon credits for this work, we're working with our lawyers, Dentons, who have done this with other areas. And this methodology is going to be a big deal. So just, without numbers, this is the way we're thinking about how clean nickel all rolls up to get some commercial advantage. So the way this is properly done, and we're very early stage on this, but the way this is properly done is by stacking up all of your greenhouse gas emissions with what your baseline operations would look like. So that would be what a typical nickel operation would look like if you weren't at all focused on carbon cost. So using traditional material movement out in the mine, using all traditional constant milling, crushing and milling, and drawing on typical electrical sources, and then using subaqueous tails, so sending the tails out and just your typical tailings facility, versus how we would plan to do it with these various improvements that we're pulling under the clean nickel umbrella. So this is the bioleach, this is the carbon capture, the stuff we talked about. This would then be electrifying material movement. Plus there'd be other items, and each of those would drop the emissions for what we would intend to build. So if we do this the right way, if we develop the methodology properly, if we get third-party approval, and we're using third-party for the development of the IP in each of these areas, if we roll this all together, and then we have detail about how we intend to monitor it and then collect data ongoing, you're able to then quantify the emissions drop between the baseline and what the project is you're building. And there should be some value with that if we're able to coordinate with a third-party exchange. So this is sort of how the rubber hits the road, specifically around the emissions related to all of the R&D we're doing. And as I mentioned, we're just getting started with the clean nickel R&D, but this is really how we'll be thinking about it. This sort of waterfall rolling together each of these improvements. So if I look forward, last year was the year of discoveries, as we mentioned. This year, we're getting into the details. We've come out with that huge resource on the A zone earlier this year. We've come out with initial results from both the carbon capture and the bioleach. Very soon, we're hoping to have the W4 updated resource out. And then we have more detail coming down the pipe on the carbon capture and the bioleach. So that's it, Cam. That was a quick drive-by of what we're doing on clean nickel. Maybe now would be a good opportunity to take some questions.
Yeah, absolutely, Sean. Thanks for the presentation. And just as a reminder to everyone in the audience, if you would like to participate in the Q&A, feel free to submit your questions on the right-hand side of your screen in the Q&A chat. Sean, we've got some questions already, though. The first one's this. Other nickel companies have formed separate subsidiaries for their low-carbon efforts. Is that part of your plan?
Yep. So we've seen that. We've seen how other companies have done that. I think for us, it's a bit premature to say what track we would go down in terms of structuring, but that is on our radar. It's also a consideration in terms of how we structure, for example, our areas of mineralization. I've said this before, that we have a high-grade business, potential business with track one, which is a company of our size could really sort of pull that thing off. On our enormous large-scale deposit, we very likely need to partner or look like a much different type of company if we're going to be able to advance that. So we are completely open to options around our areas of mineralization. Similarly, we wrap this all together with the clean nickel umbrella. And perhaps as we have breakthroughs on this front, it may make sense to have a subsidiary that controls that IP and that whole sort of pull together on the clean nickel, and also has the carbon credit value attached to it. But it's a bit premature, Cam, at this point to be talking about that, because I just want to figure out sort of where the data is going to take us.
No, fair enough. Another question: when do you expect the W4 resource to be out, and what are you expecting in terms of size?
Paul, this is in your. Why don't you take this one?
Yeah, well, we have it out with an arm's length third party. They're doing the work now. I anticipate that we'll have the resource out before summer, so before the end of Q2. I'm quite excited by the potential. I know our drilling here in 2023, we were able to extend the mineralization down an additional 200 meters from where it was before. So really, I'm seeing that there's going to be a significant increase in the size of the overall deposit just based upon the work that we've added to it.
Okay, great. Regarding the large low-grade deposit at Carlang, what do you think the potential is there for the size?
Yeah,
Paul,
I'll take this one again. So like Carlang, it's a great area. I mean, we really had a head start there. I worked in the Shaw Dome. One of my first jobs was actually walking in Carman Township to map the ultramafics down there. So if you want to flip just to slide 20, Cam, in the appendices. Yeah, so that's the government geology map of our Carlang area. That light gray box you see is actually the area that we've tested with the drilling and came out with our resource with upwards of 1 billion tons of indicated and inferred nickel resource. We know there's an additional 4 times the strike length of that style of mineralization just based on the outcrop and previous work that we've done ourselves in the area. So I see it being you could have something that's 5 times the size of what we've already put out in March for Carlang A. Similarly, we are doing some follow-up work this summer,
and it's drilling too, right, Paul? There's the drilling slide.
It's drilling. This is historic drill locations from the 1960s up to about 2016 in the area. I did a number of these holes with previous companies, so I really had a head start of knowing what was there before we drilled it with EV&I. But you can see the distribution of drill holes here. A number of them bottomed in dunite, so we know that it goes deeper than the bottom of those drill holes. We're quite excited by that. This summer, we're actually doing a surface sampling program. We have so much outcrop that we're going to be able to really define the widths and the grades of these other zones and give people a really good idea of what the potential could be. And that'll also tie back into our carbon capture type program as well.
Cool. All right. How do you think that you compare to the world's largest undeveloped nickel sulfide projects, just in regards to size and valuation?
Okay, I'll take that. Yeah, I think we compare very well. So I pulled, I've got this slide in the appendix. So if you look at the top 10 undeveloped nickel sulfide projects and you stack them up by size. So this is the nickel contained in situ. We are one of the largest ones in the world. That's us in the middle with the green bar. So I think what we've identified on the A zone puts us up amongst the largest undeveloped projects in the world. So this is just the A zone. So you heard Paul mention that we're very comfortable that the unit extends more than 5 times longer than what we've drilled so far. So we'll get more data around our own grab sample from the outcrop going all the way up the Carlang later this year. But realistically, there's a heck of a lot more nickel in the ground for the Carlang than just what we put up in the A zone. So if you look, the question about how we compare by size, we very well could have one of the largest undeveloped nickel projects in the world, especially if you think about that green bar being 5 times larger if we just get around to drilling more than just the A zone. So by size, we're already very high on the board. And I don't think that any of these blue bars are just 20% in to the mineralization. So size, we very easily could have the largest in the world. And then if you flip over to valuation, so again, this is just all drawn from public data. And if you look at those same 10 companies again, and if you do it by enterprise value to resource ton, So that takes the equity value, takes out your cash, also considers the debt. So it's kind of an apples to apples, but frankly, it's all over the shop in terms of what the market valuation is, the enterprise value per resource ton. You've got a few of the companies from the prior slide that are sort of off the charts, but all 10 of those projects, those companies, they average 143 US dollars of enterprise value per resource ton. And you see EV Nickel on the far right with the Carlang A zone, we're at $1 US. So we're deeply, deeply undervalued. And again, our project has a number of very key things about it. We're just outside of a major mining town. We're accessible by road and power. It's at surface with minimal overburden, which is a big differentiator. All of those things to the rest of these blue bars with these projects. So we have one of the largest assets in the world. If you look at undeveloped, and we're only 20% in. So we very easily could have the largest undeveloped nickel sulfide project in the world. And then if you look at today's valuation, it's ridiculously low. So we trade at $1 per ton of nickel in the ground, which is radically different than these other large projects in the world. So in response, Cam, I think we stack up very well by size and absolutely by value.
Okay, great. Another question, given your carbon capture qualifying credentials, will you be receiving a government contribution towards your initial CapEx costs?
Yeah, so on the initial CapEx, there's obviously been very interesting policies that have come out from the Canadian federal government crediting back projects that are contributing into this new clean economy. So we anticipate, yes, there will be very nice tax credits for the CapEx towards any potential operation. It's a bit early for us to talk about that now. We need to put numbers on what it would cost for us to develop these tracks, but we're very confident that what we are talking about here would qualify for those tax credits as they've been laid out by the government. So it's an exciting environment in which we're talking about a project going forward. Again, it comes back to hugely supportive levels of government, but we do anticipate that we'd be able to qualify for those credits. In addition, not just sort of a better tax treatment of the dollars we spend, but also I anticipate that you're going to have government direct support coming in, whether from the Canadian government or branches of the US government, to get nickel projects like ours in a jurisdiction and a location like ours advanced along.
Okay, great. Does the bioleaching oxidize the Timmins area iron nickel sulfides into sulfate? And how is this sulfate going to be removed from the solution? The question speaks about CO2 being released in the atmosphere with other practices. So what's your alternative?
Paul, you want to take that?
Sure, I'll take the first part. The second one kind of is a separate topic. But in terms of, do we capture the sulfate from the solution? And basically, this is really where our processing research is taking us towards. One of the products that the actual nickel battery makers want is a nickel sulfate. So to be able to use that sulfate to precipitate out a product that is in demand by the batteries, that's going to be a great solution. There are, you do have to control your sulfate, but we are blessed with the W4 deposit being all pentlandite. So we're actually looking at making a much smaller amount of sulfate than we would say out of the projects in Sudbury using the pyrrhotite concentrates. We'll get a much higher percentage of sulfate that you have to control. But there are ways to control it. One is to precipitate out gypsum, which will accommodate for that sulfate. Now, what was the second part of the question on the CO2?
It was just a question. It was sort of an indication. Others use burned limestone, which releases CO2 into the atmosphere. And the question is just wondering, what's your alternative to that?
Well, thankfully, with our ultramafics, they are hugely acid consuming. And so we're probably going to be able to use our own tailings to be able to put it into it to act as a buffer to bring down your pH level, or to bring up your pH level, and then precipitate out these sulfates and the appropriate type of mineral that we want that'll be very stable and able to be stored for a long period, potentially even a sellable byproduct that we could use to sell into other types of industry.
Right. Okay. Question is that it's looking very expensive to potentially bring everything together. So, do you have sufficient financing for this year? And are you looking for a strategic partner, or have there been any talks with a major?
Yeah, so financing for this year. Again, we are coming out with a resource next month. All of that drilling has been done. In addition, we're talking about research and development we're doing in the lab, for which we have the government funding. So we are financed for this work to be done. So I want to be very clear. We have a cash balance that has us comfortably set up for everything we say we're going to do. In those areas. So coming out with that new resource on W4, and then all of the R&D on the clean nickel, especially because the government funding comes in on that. So that's where we stand for these things we say we're going to be delivering on. The second part of the question about partnering up. So yes, we have been in communication, and we've said this publicly before, with more than one of the major mining companies. And we're talking to them specifically about the Carl Lang potential. Again, coming back to this point that a company that looks like ours very likely needs to be partnering up to advance a project like that. So yes, we are in communication with major miners who are interested by that large scale Carl Lang, especially when we think about it as being bigger than the A zone. So we're financed for what we say we need to do. And then, yes, we're partnering up, or I should say, we're discussing with partners about how we potentially move forward that large scale project.
Great. Tim is also wanting to know if you're going to be drilling this year.
Yeah, so we're not drilling right now. We intend to be drilling later this year, but we've got to figure out sort of where things land. Obviously, in this market, with this share price, and by extension, us being valued at $1 enterprise value for resource ton in the ground, something's got to change there. We have plans for future drilling, obviously. W4, for example, we're going to come out with this resource. It's going to look a lot better than the 2010 resource, but that just gets us started because we've said we're permitting the W4. And as we go down that permitting track with the intention to be in operations in 3 to 4 years, we'll obviously need to be drilling off more of the W4 to move everything over to indicated and better in terms of the categories. So there's a bunch more drilling to be done on W4. Paul has lots of very interesting targets for additional high grade. So there's drilling to be done there. Plus, we've got to decide what we do at Carl Lang, wherein we put up this enormous resource on just the first 20%. Do we finance and drill off the remainder? And then instead of me just talking about what it is, we then have a chart that shows we have the largest deposit in the world. I'm not sure necessarily what the value would be from the market on that. But a long answer to the question, we're not drilling right now. We do intend to be drilling again. But for that, we need to change something on our financing. And we are hoping for a better share price before we do that.
Okay, fair enough. Well, Paul, Sean, I want to thank both of you for coming on today, going through a great presentation and a very engaging Q&A session. Of course, I also want to thank everyone that's joined us today, but that's all the questions that we have. So before we wrap up, Sean, I want to pass things over to you for any closing remarks.
Yeah, thank you. And again, thanks everybody for participating. We're very open and accessible. So any questions beyond this summit always can come in. info@evnickel.com. Come straight to the two of us. So I'd wrap up just by stressing the fact that this clean nickel work, the work around trying to minimize carbon and do things a little differently, the rethinking, this is absolutely why we are doing this. So this is the thing that gets us most excited. We're finding an enormous amount of nickel in the Shaw Dome, sort of the typical thing that an exploration company like ours does. But also, we're doing a lot of innovative work in the lab, which I think is a differentiator. So again, this clean nickel is more than just a simple marketing trademark for us. We push everything under it, and we're trying to rethink every one of the stages of potential nickel operations. I think that should begin differentiating us. We know that it rings well with the car companies. Because again, when you look at what the car companies have said, and we're in communication with them a lot more, but if you look at what they've said publicly, it's a strange world that they're wading into to try to buy low carbon nickel from. So we are setting up our company exactly in line with the questions they're asking. So again, the clean nickel thing is in the DNA of our company, and this is why we're doing it.